Well, hello everyone. My name is Sharon Spencer with IAAP, and I want to welcome you all to HTML5 and ARIA for meeting WCAG 2.0 success criteria. Before we start the webinar, I want to quickly review a few system items. Everyone should be logged into Adobe Connect, or you can follow along with the presentation URL and over the phone. To access the presentation URL, there's a link in the confirmation email that you received when you registered or in the reminder email that was sent out to you a few days ago. And during the webinar today, if you do want to ask questions of our speaker, I know John does plan to stop throughout and at the end for questions. So if you do have a question or a comment that you want to make, just type it into Adobe Connect. If you look at your screen, you'll see the chat area on the right side of the screen. Down at the bottom of that area, there's a text box. Just type into the text box and then hit enter or click on that send icon. To guard against background noise, I have put everyone on mute, but if you want to ask a question at the end of the webinar, if there's time, you can ask it over the phone by pressing #6 to unmute your line, and then *6 puts you back on mute. Or, of course, you can put the message in the chat area. And again, if we have time at the end, if you want to ask a question and you're connected via voice over IP, you can put a message in the chat and I'll unmute your phone. If you are hearing audio over both your computer speakers and the phone, you can hang up the phone and listen via computer only, or you can turn off your computer speakers and listen via phone only. And to turn off your computer speakers, there's a green speaker icon at the top. Just click on that to mute your speakers. John will be sharing his desktop. In order to see his screen better, you can zoom in using the full screen icon at the top right-hand side of the screen area. Just click on that to get into full screen mode, and then click again to get out of full screen mode so that you can see the chat area. And there's also a zoom in button if you want to get an even closer picture of what John is doing. Lastly, I want to remind everybody we will be recording this webinar. So again, I want to thank you all for joining us today. Our speaker is Dr. John Gunderson. Dr. Gunderson is the Coordinator of Information Technology Accessibility in the Division of Disability Resources and Education Services at the University of Illinois. At Illinois, he is responsible for computer and IT accessibility issues for students with disabilities. John is also the chair of the Open Ajax Accessibility Task Force, and he's a member of the W3C Protocols and Formats Working Group working on ARIA. So we are delighted to have John with us as today's speaker. So John, thank you for doing this webinar for us, and I'll turn things over to you.
Hello, welcome everyone. Today, thank you for inviting me to come. I'm really excited about a lot of the new changes that are happening to help us change from some of the new standards that will help us make things even more accessible but more usable by people with disabilities. So I guess we can get started here. So all of the slides that I will be showing you today are HTML slides. And this first slide here is an overview of what we'll be talking about today. At the bottom of this HTML slide is a link to this presentation. So if you want to go back and refer to any of the slides, it's a publicly available link. There's no login or password that you need to go back and look at the slides. So what are we going to talk about today? 5 things. W3C standards for web accessibility. I think we're kind of entering a new era of accessibility, and web standards are a big part of that, and browser standards. And the next topic would be ARIA landmark design patterns. So, so how do we use these new technologies? And one of the easiest, I think, to start including in your designs or when you're remediating pages is to start using ARIA landmarks. Well, how should they be used? What are they about? One of the features of ARIA will help with some of the WCAG requirements related to link context. And we'll look at how ARIA can be used to provide programmatic link context when previously in HTML we didn't have those programmatic techniques to do that. And then ARIA for accessible forms. Many of you are probably aware that WCAG 2.0 has a number of new requirements for accessibility of forms. It's not just labels anymore, but it's accessible feedback and accessible instruction. So we'll look at some of the ARIA techniques that are available to support that. And the last topic I'll spend a little bit of time on are some open source tools that we're developing here at the University of Illinois and in cooperation with the Open Accessibility Alliance to help people evaluate for these design patterns and for using ARIA and HTML5. And I can talk a little bit more about that later. So any questions before we get started here? Okay. WCAG, the W3C Web Content Accessibility Guidelines have become an international standard. And even in the United States, the Section 508 refresh on the information technology standards will include WCAG level A and double A conformance as one of the ways that people will be able to comply with the new, or at least the federal government will comply with the new, with the revised standards. And so WCAG is now kind of this international standard that I think we all need to understand. And we need to understand that especially in the relationship to web content. There's a lot of requirements. How many people are already familiar with WCAG? Maybe people can type yes or no into the chat. Let's try some interaction here. Yes. Here's a better question. How many people have read WCAG all the way through? Yes. Oh, nope, nope, yes. Well, it's a big document. There's a lot of stuff in there. There's just in terms of level A and double A requirements, there's like 45 success criteria. So for those who aren't so familiar with WCAG, there's kind of 3 levels. There's principles, 4 principles, and then 16 guidelines, and then 67 odd success criteria. And the success criteria are broken down into 3 levels. Level A, which is considered the most important, double A, which is the next most important, and triple A, the next level of importance. I think one of the misunderstandings that many people, and even I had for a long time about WCAG, is I thought it was going to be a standard that told me what I was supposed to do with HTML or with other technologies. And what WCAG really is, it tells people what the requirement for people with disabilities are. And then people have to try to figure out, okay, well, how does the technology I'm using, how can that be used to meet this requirement? So I think that was a frustrating part because I wanted it to be a little bit different than what it is. But now that I understand what it is, it helps me understand how to use WCAG to promote accessibility. So WCAG is really about what are the needs of people with disabilities and also trying to prioritize those needs in terms of helping developers focus. Because one of my issues is when I work with developers, if I just point them to WCAG, it usually doesn't help them very much because there's a lot of stuff there for them to read, and they don't understand it, and most developers and designers I know are very busy people. So, and that's part of why we've developed the tools and the rules we'll be talking about later is to help them understand how they can meet, what are the ways that we want them to use to meet certain requirements, and how can we use tools and things to filter out these requirements. Okay, one of the new technologies available is, I'm on the next slide, slide 3 now, is the Accessible Rich Internet Applications, which just became a recommendation last March. It's been under development for over 10 years. Finally became a recommendation last March, working on ARIA 1.1. ARIA technologies are being applied, but I think the big important part of, sure, I can post the slides URLs. Here we go. There. Okay. Thanks for reminding me. Okay. Let's see. I got to do F11 again. No. Let's see. Yeah, F11. Okay. The ARIA recommendation here is basically what ARIA is a way to describe. ARIA was originally developed by the W3C as a way to repair inaccessible HTML. It was first sold to the web development community as a repair technology. If you have an inaccessible application, or if you're using JavaScript and other things to create things that aren't defined in HTML4, so like grids and trees and menus and these types of things which don't have any HTML4 semantics, you can use this accessible rich internet application specification to start to define these structures so that that information can be communicated to assistive technologies. And so part of that, and a big part of, I think, one of the big misunderstandings about when developers first look at accessible ARIA specification is they start to look at all of these different roles and properties and states, and they just start spreading them around their application, thinking that that's somehow magically going to make their application more accessible. And in my experience, when people just get to ARIA, if they don't understand much about how it works, they're actually making their applications less accessible because they look, the favorite one I think in ARIA is the menu role. Oh, I've got menus in my application, so I'll start putting all this menu stuff around. But they don't really understand the other parts of ARIA, which is keyboard focus management and keyboard support. Because really what ARIA widget roles do is tell people something about how can I interact with this thing? Is this thing a menu? Well, then I should be able to use cursor keys to move around it. If it's a grid, well, it's a two-dimensional object. I should be able to use cursor keys to move around. If it's a tree, should be able to use space and to open and close leaves and things like that. So if there isn't keyboard support and you're adding these ARIA roles and they get focused, it's going to just be more confusing to people. So ARIA, in some ways, is dangerous for developers because they look in there and they start to, it's like a candy store. They start looking at all this stuff and say, wow, I've got this stuff in. So we have to be a little bit careful with ARIA. But ARIA has two parts to it. One is the ARIA landmarks, which are basically not widget roles. They're basically ways to break up a web page into defined sections, similar to how people use visual styling techniques to break the page up visually into sections. ARIA now provides a way to programmatically indicate those sections using ARIA landmarks. And we're not going to talk a lot about widget roles today, but maybe in a future webinar, if they're interested, I could talk about some of the basics of ARIA widget technology at some point. And I know they've had other webinars related to the use of ARIA widgets. So let's see if I can go back here. Okay. Any questions about ARIA? Okay. I think one of the most exciting, one more thing I want to mention about ARIA is that while ARIA was originally sold to the web development and web standards community as a repair language, it's now being transformed into a design language. And I think in HTML5, we're starting to see that. In HTML5, and especially 5.1, ARIA is now considered part of the accessibility solution in these new specifications like HTML5 and other technologies like SVG and EPUB3 are all using ARIA as the accessible design language. So it's not just for repair anymore. It's also part of the design process. And I think the exciting thing to me about HTML5 is that it's starting to define how people should be using this technology to make things more accessible. In HTML4, there was very little information about how browsers should translate HTML information into accessibility APIs for use by assistive technologies. So it's all kind of by convention. So there are sometimes, while a lot of it's the same, there are a lot of differences between how browser A and browser B may represent the same web page to assistive technology. In HTML5, these bindings or these relationships between HTML markup and accessibility API in a particular platform is going to be part of the specification. So I think we're moving in an age from what I call kind of situational accessibility. I have a browser, I have a assistive technology, and if I get those combination of things to work, I now have an accessible web application for people to use. I'm hoping that we are now moving into an age where I can use standards to design the web application, and I'll know it'll work on a much wider range of technologies. And we all know with the proliferation of portable devices, and there's just a lot more options for people to access information, including people with disabilities. So I know kind of, at least around Illinois, it was always designing with, IE and some version of JAWS, and hopefully we can move away from that into this new design. And just one example of that is in the HTML5 specification, talking about design, is that when we look at ARIA landmark roles, so I'm on, oops, forgot to put the slide in, on slide 5 here now. So slide 5 shows a snippet of the HTML5 specification related to the main element. So what do people think this main element came from? Where did main element come from? Anybody heard of main element before? What's it for? What's this main element for? Why was it put in? Why was this main element put in to HTML5? To identify the body of the page, indicating, yeah, well, if I'm a web developer, why do I care about that? Can't people just see it? What's the main content of my page? Right, so this is being put in there because of accessibility. Steve Faulkner proposed this main element, and it's now part of the specification. So we're now seeing the specification supporting Section 508 and WCAG requirements. Very important. And if we take a little bit closer look at this main element in the specification, we can see that there's information related to the ARIA role attribute and ARIA properties and states. ARIA is integrated into the HTML5 spec. It's not something over here. It's actually talking about it. And one of the main things that, especially with section elements, is that it restricts which ARIA roles can go on a particular element. So you can see here that, well, in the image, not everybody who can see the image, I had to put images in here to make the slides work. But I don't want to talk about that part. But a main element can only have the role main or have the role presentation. Okay, those are the only two. Otherwise, it's an invalid HTML5 document. If I try to put a role menu on here, or role navigation, or role banner, the HTML5 validator itself would say you're not doing something right. So again, we're starting to see design patterns being put in to the HTML5 spec and information about accessibility and accessible design practices put into the HTML5 specification. So I think these are important changes and things that, as people in the accessibility field, we need to leverage and support. I know there's still a lot of pressure and a lot of inconsistencies of implementation sometimes, and oftentimes people get focused on the experience in a particular, trying to create a consistent experience across different screen readers. But I think standards should be an important part if we're going to more widely get developers to support accessibility and understand it. I think that's an important part. It's got to make sense to developers. How do we, and I think by getting it into the standards, having design patterns that make sense to developers and support the needs of people with disabilities, I think, is where we should be going. Okay.
John, there were two questions from a couple minutes back. And the first one, I don't think you addressed these. One was, is a tree grid possible?
Is a tree grid possible? Yeah, there's tree grid roles. There's widget roles related to tree grids. And there's design patterns in the ARIA authoring guide. The ARIA authoring guide group has been meeting now after a hiatus of a few years or so, is starting to meet regularly again. They're meeting once a week. And so I think we'll be seeing updated design patterns. I wasn't planning on talking about tree grids today, so maybe if there's time at the end, I can point people. We can talk about it some more. So, and there was another question?
Yes, and this relates to ARIA. The question is, can you identify current ARIA usage by the major AT in the market and or a significant open source AT? ARIA can't be a solution if ATs don't know that it's there.
Okay, well, so let's talk a little bit about how ARIA works. So ARIA is basically, in the specification, talks about how information so between the HTML5 specification and the ARIA specification, it talks about how when markup is in a web page, how that will be communicated to accessibility APIs. Okay, so accessibility APIs are the interface between the operating system and assistive technology. So to a certain extent, and then the assistive technologies then, in many cases, don't even know that it's ARIA markup or standard HTML5 markup. Many times it's transparent to them where the accessibility came from. There are new features that people are putting into ARIA. And I think one of the things that is really needed, and something that we're doing here at Illinois, we started a testing group, is to start testing libraries and assistive technologies for implementation. So part of the process, okay, so let me just back up one more step. Okay, so when ARIA became a recommendation last March, basically the working group had to show that at least every browser, or at least 2 browsers, implemented the accessibility requirement for that particular ARIA feature. At least 2 browsers had to implement it on more than one, and across at least more than one operating system. So the operating systems were Linux and OS X and Windows, primarily MFAA, although I think the next round UI Automate. So that's how ARIA became a specification. And then in terms of assistive technology, many of the ARIA features are assistive technologies really didn't have to do anything if they were using accessibility APIs. Other features, they need to do they need to add new features. But along the path, especially Apple and JAWS and NVDA, they've been reading the specs and implementing it. And I'll be showing implementation for the features I'm talking here today with. And Stephen Faulkner of the Paciello Group has a page related to how browsers are implementing ARIA and HTML5 features. So you can look at where browsers are at. I don't know of a similar page for assistive technologies. And I think that's something the community needs, because I think the questions that people are asking are the same questions I'm asking. That's one of the reasons why here at Illinois we started a group. We meet once a week, and we're looking at JavaScript libraries and assistive technology and starting to test. You know, what's in these libraries, what works in browsers, what doesn't work in browsers, so that we can have best practices, develop best practices, and know where the potholes are. But So that is a missing component. And I'm not going to solve it in this webinar. I wish I had a great resource for people to go to because I'd go to it. But it's a community need that we all need to work together, and maybe that's something, you know, IIAP can help with, help organize some groups around this. I'd be very interested in that. So I missed some questions here. Boy, a lot of traffic here. Okay. No shims for ARIA markup, but there are shims for HTML5 support in legacy browsers. Is there any movement to support feature detection so JavaScript can provide accessibility shims for unsupported features? AI Squared will be releasing a white paper outline level support for each role, property, and state. Okay. Yeah, so there's a lot of you know, so maybe we could talk more about this at the end. Otherwise, we're already 25 minutes in, and I'm still on slide 5. So that's 5 minutes per slide. We're never going to make it all the way through this thing.
Yes, I think that's a good idea, John.
So we're only going to get through halfway if we keep at this pace. All right. So, well, let's get on to some real stuff. I mean, some stuff that I was more prepared to talk about. So, I mean, it's all interesting stuff, and I'm with you guys. I'm with you. I wish there's better information, but we need people. We need people. So if you're interested, oh, and just a note, I'll say it at the end. If you're interested in working with the W3C or with some of these other testing projects, please send me an email. I'd like to know who people are interested. We're always looking for people in our group, and the W3C, especially the PF group, needs more bodies. We need more people. There's, you know, the web is getting more complex, and the same group of people can't do everything. Okay, so the first section here, landmarks, HTML5 section elements, and headings. So we've got these new things. We've got ARIA landmarks. HTML5 now has these section elements. And we've got our old standby from HTML4 headings. How do these things all work together? What's the coding practices or design patterns we want to use to create accessible web pages? So this is slide 6. So if we go to slide 7, so I'll put the link into the channel. See, I'm getting better. I'm learning here, getting the slides in.
John, you don't need to post the link for every slide. I'll post the link to the whole presentation, and that way everyone will have it, and then they can just progress as you progress. Okay. All right. So slide 7 here basically talks about the ARIA landmark roles. And I think this is the easiest introduction or starting to use ARIA. Like I said earlier, ARIA has kind of two parts to it. They have landmarks, which are basically ways to indicate the sections of a web page, and then ARIA widget roles, which are related to customized widgets that aren't represented in standard HTML. So the ARIA landmarks defined in the specification are application, banner, complementary, content info, form, main, navigation, region, and search. Now, for those who are real ARIA aficionados or who've read the ARIA specification, you're probably going to say region isn't a landmark. And in the current specification, it's not. But part of the specification talks about when a region has a label, it can be considered a landmark type structure. So how to use region will be clarified in ARIA 1.1. There's a lot of people using the region with an ARIA label as a landmark role, and assistive technology, well, some assistive technology supports it, NVDA and JAWS. VoiceOver does not. But so that's being addressed. So just a little thing about regions. Okay, so we move on to slide 8 here. So this is our disability website. So about 4 years ago, our director, who is actually in the image here, a picture of him, he just retired. About 4 years ago, our director wanted to update the DRES website, and we've been working on it with ARIA for a long time, and we wanted to include ARIA
in our new design of our website, and for laying out sections of content. So, we hired a private development company to do it, and I said, well, can I meet with you to talk about these ARIA landmarks and how to use it? And they said, oh, that would be really nice, but, you're a busy guy, and we'll just read the specification, and we'll figure it out. How do people think that worked out? You think we got something that we wanted? You can type yes or no. Poorly. Okay. You've done this before? Maybe you've had experience with this. No, don't bother me with accessibility. We'll figure it out. Okay, yeah, right. Okay. So, well, the ARIA, this is 4 years ago, so again, they looked at the ARIA specification. Ooh, and it was a candy store for accessibility. Wow, look at all these roles. Look at all this stuff there. And, what they came back with, we had, if you go to our website, you'll see that if you mouse over certain elements that there's flyout menus that appear. So they saw menu and they started putting menu everywhere. They thought everything was a menu. But their big problem with when they use the ARIA menu role, which may be appropriate, it's one design pattern for these flyout menus. It's not the only one, but it's one that makes sense. May make sense for design. But there was no keyboard support to manage the focus. And one of my big concerns back then was these menu roles were overriding the link role. So one of my concerns is when you override, put a role menu on a link, it's no longer read as a link, it's read as a menu. And I was unclear to me what, users of assistive technology would think if they got menu roles on a web page. What does that mean? They found this role called navigation, and so they had a lot of these flyout menus were nested lists of links. And so they not only put the navigation landmarks on the top level list, but they put on all the sub-lists. So we had what I call kind of navigation pollution. There was a lot of landmark roles, that were redundant. And the other thing that they did was that they put the roles on the UL element. And what happens when you put role navigation on a UL element? Anybody do that? Anybody ever put role navigation on a UL element? What does that do to assistive technologies? Oh, come on. Somebody's got to have done that. Let's see. Who's here? I recognize some of the names. Oh, I better not call anybody out. But, okay. But what happens is it's not a list anymore. It's this navigation thing. I mean, I had a colleague who was blind, and I did that. I said, oh, navigation. I got an unordered list of links. I'll put role navigation on the unordered list element. And he came back to me and said, how come how come you're not using list of links anymore? What do you mean not using list of links? I've got a list of links. I got the UL element, LI. Well, I don't hear the, link, item 1 of 5 anymore. Well, the role overrode the semantics of it being a list, the role navigation. So you have to be a little bit careful. We'll talk about that in the design pattern in a minute. Some of the landmarks made some sense. Others, landmarks that they put in didn't make sense. They seem to be more programmatic. Some content in landmarks, some content not in landmarks, and that's a design pattern. I think that's an important one. And they found this role called article, and they love the article role because we have lots of little snippets. But article is not considered a landmark, at least from an ARIA standpoint. And I think article is going to be confusing because article is also a new HTML5 element role. So we'll talk about that briefly, but that's another role that seems like, wow, shouldn't article be a landmark? But it's not. It has a specific role, purpose in ARIA, but the article element in HTML5 can be used not only for that purpose, but many other purposes. So I think there's some potential confusion. So you have to be a little bit careful if you're using the article role. All right, so slide 10 here is an image of kind of showing what landmarks we did put in. We're actually updating this now based on the new specification and use patterns. So I said this was developed 4 years ago. Didn't have all the design patterns we have now. So we're having to go back and update some of our features, but that we're putting in. And so this is what we put together. So at the top, we have a banner landmark, and inside that banner landmark, and so a banner landmark to us was the content that stays the same at the top of the page as you go between page and page. So we have a banner landmark on top. Inside that is a navigation landmark called Top Menu, which included links like My Quick Links, About, Knowledge Center, Contact, a search box, which had a search landmark. And then we defined a main landmark. Now, for many of you who, the home page is kind of different typically than all the other pages. Home page is typically a lot about navigation. So we put in the main landmark all of these navigational links and some of these info links that are related to the history and calendar and upcoming events. And so inside the main landmark, we had this navigation landmark, just one of this nested list of links, which were visible to assistive technologies without having to be flown out, so that the links were always visible to screen readers. So off-screen techniques when they weren't available. We had 3 other regions. The region landmark called Spotlight. So this is kind of like an article or something recently in the news. We have a section called A History of Firsts. For people who aren't familiar, Illinois has an over 60-year history now of providing services to students with disabilities, starting after World War II, veterans who were being denied access to the University of Illinois because of their disability, basically protested and fought to get access, were granted access, and started the first disability services program for veterans in the country at a major university. And then we have a calendar. And then on the bottom of the page, we had a complementary landmark, which we're going to be changing to a content info landmark. And that has information about, this is stuff that appears at the bottom of all the pages. And it had 2 sections. It had 2 regions called Contact and Maps, and another one called FAQs. So we tried to break up these regions into functional units because these basically become a way for people using assistive technologies to navigate to the sections of the page. So Twitter Bootstrap make use of ARIA. Is the usage correct in their implementations? We're starting to use Bootstrap in some of our tools, but I can't answer that. Landmarks, I'm not sure what Bootstrap does with landmarks. Maybe we can talk about that at the end. Bootstrap is something I'm very interested in, and actually working with Victor Zarin to do a presentation at CSUN on Bootstrap and accessibility. How can it help us? Slide 11 here shows an image of the page, and using the NVDA screen reader, and both NVDA and JAWS have a list of functions. So you can bring up a list of landmarks or a list of links or a list of headings. This is the NVDA version of that. For people who, NVDA is an open source screen reader, so it's free, but I do encourage people to support them. I think it's a really great tool for developers. And there's also other screen readers like JAWS that people have access to that have a lot of great features too, and OS X has VoiceOver built into it, but I don't believe I have found a list of feature in VoiceOver. But this shows us the landmarks on this particular page. So there's a dialog box in the middle of the page, and in that I can see a tree view of the landmarks. So for this page, we see banner at the top, My Quick Links, top menu navigation, search. Under Disability Resources, the main content, we have the Services and Resources Navigation, Spotlight, History of First, Events Calendar region, and then the contact information at the bottom. So this is what users actually get when you start using landmarks, and I think it's really important for developers when you use landmarks to use some type of list of feature like here to kind of see the functional units that you're creating, the functional landmarks. Okay, so how are we doing on time here? Okay, we're picking up the pace. We're down to 4 minutes a slide, so we might get through all of these. Slide 12 here is another DRES page. This is a page, more of our information page. I think this is a little bit more typical after you get off the home page. This page has, again, the banner information at the top, content info, same as the home page. Those are the two things that are the same, but the main content is a little bit different. The left-hand side is a navigation landmark. The main content is on the right-hand side and center. Inside the main content, we had a breadcrumbs, which we label as a navigation landmark inside main. And then we often had a little complementary or pop-out information for additional information, which right now we're using as a region landmark, but it could be a complementary information landmark too. So there's always design choices, but you want to get the structure right, you want to get the labeling right. So we'll talk a little bit about some of the design patterns in a minute here. And again, slide 13 shows a list of landmarks here. So here we have the banner landmark, My Quick Links, top menu navigation search, same as the home page. Services and Resources navigation, that's the left-hand side navigation, the main content, and then content info at the bottom. So we have, I think, a pretty good coverage of allowing people who are using assistive technologies to get to these pages much quicker, get to the sections and find out what the sections are and label them. So much more effective, I think, than using just headings alone, because headings you can't tell where something stops or where something ends. It's not always clear with just listening at the labels here. You can create container models of this is the main content, this is the main navigation. Any questions? So have I missed any questions here?
There's been some conversation about headings versus landmarks, and I think you might have just touched on that, but the question was, and I'm looking for the question.
Well, I'm going to talk about that right now. So these are like lead-ins. These guys are like leading me into the next thing. See, these guys are listening, or inquiring minds want to know. So how do we use all of this stuff together? So here, with the main landmark design pattern. So this is the pattern I use, and something we've worked with the Open Accessibility Alliance on. So the main landmark, so this is probably the most important landmark because it's indicating the main content of the page. Typically, a page only has one main landmark. Sometimes if you're looking at a mashup or a portal application, depending on the design patterns that you're using for the portlets and things, you might have more than one main. What I use for main is also I want to use an H1 to indicate the start of the main content. So provide a redundant way for people to navigate to the main content. So if I know about header navigation, if you're using a page I designed, you can get there through navigating H1s, or you can use the list of landmarks and get there by finding the main landmark. And if there's only one main landmark, you don't need to use any label on it. The landmark itself is self-explanatory. If we scroll down here, if you do have multiple landmarks, then the pattern changes a little bit. So here we have, if you have more than one landmark of the same type, then you need to provide a label for it. So this shows us I basically have two divs in the second example on this slide. a div with role, two divs with role main, but they now include the ARIA labeled by attribute. So this is a way to provide a name for this landmark that points to the H1 associated with that main landmark. So basically, each role main would have its own H1, and the role main would point to the ARIA label, would create a label using the H1 as its label. So again, reusing the content of the H1 to identify what's different, what's the title of this content versus the title of this content to provide that navigation. So whether I bring up a list of lists, I can see the H1s, or if I bring up a list of landmarks now, instead of just saying main, 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 I'll see main title 1, main title 2, main title 3. Okay? Okay. A lot of conversation. Great. The navigation landmark design pattern. So I limit the navigation landmark. So again, in WCAG, we have these requirements for website navigation. How many people are familiar with the website navigation requirements in WCAG? Anybody know what they are? What are the website? Yep, somewhat familiar. If you're using an old browser, what are some of the requirements for website navigation in WCAG? Again, and something that's a lot different than WCAG 1.0. Ooh, lots of people are typing. We're talking about ARIA, HTML5, and WCAG 2.0. So we're talking about all three. Okay. Well, in terms of WCAG requirements, WCAG requires that there be more than one way to navigate to web pages within a website. So typically a search and some type of link navigation is how people solve this issue. The other requirements are that consistent ordering of content on pages. So you don't, so navigation, main, other information, other major constructions on that page have to be the same, and consistent labeling. So you don't call something the same thing that maybe repeats on more than one page, one thing in one page and something else in another page. Or maybe it has a label sometimes and maybe it doesn't have a label sometimes. That's confusing. So I restrict the navigation landmark to links related to navigating this website. And I think that that's useful to people because then they know if I go to the navigation landmark and I pick a link, I'm most likely going to be staying within the website that I'm currently on. So that's just my thing. Other people may have other ideas on the navigation landmark. But I think it's a pattern that helps people meet the WCAG 2.0 requirements related to website navigation in a very consistent way. For navigation landmarks, I use the H2 to indicate the top of the navigation, to provide a label for the type of navigation this is providing. And that way, again, if somebody knows about header navigation, they can get to the navigation landmark. If they know about landmark navigation, they can use role navigation, the landmark list navigation, or landmark navigation features of browsers. If there's more, again, if there's more than one navigation landmark, we can use ARIA labeled by to point to the H2 content. Again, here, I just want to point out what I talked about a little bit earlier. You'll notice in this coding pattern on slide 15 here is that I have a div element with the role equals navigation. And then after the div element, there's an H2 giving a title to that navigation. And then there's the unordered list of links. And I have to put role navigation on the div element here because if I put it on the UL element, it'll basically destroy the semantics of the list. ARIA, at least in the current accessibility APIs, HTML elements can only have one role. Put role navigation on the UL element, it's not a list anymore. It's this landmark. And so that's why I have to put it in a container containing div. Okay. And again, if we have more than one navigation landmark, we want to require each navigation landmark to have a title. And I think the best way to do that, there are other ARIA labeling techniques, but the best way is to use H2s, again, to provide the redundant means to identify and navigate by users of assistive technology to the navigation. And we also have consistent labeling, so the landmark will have the same title as the H2 element. So, slide 16 here shows landmark design patterns. So banners should always be the top level. Content info should always be the top level. So banner is that information at the top of the page that's consistent across most of the pages on the website. Content info is usually the information at the bottom of the page that's consistent across most of the pages on the website. The main landmark should be a top-level land, and these should all be top-level landmarks just like the main landmark. If I bring up a list of landmarks, those would be the ones at the top level in a tree view. Navigation is often a top level, but doesn't necessarily, depending on the design of the page. Complementary can also be top level, but depending on the design of the page and how complementary is used. Some people want to put complementary information inside the main landmark. The other pattern that I use is when a landmark of the same type is used more than once on a page, it must have a label. Another rule is never to nest the landmark of the same type in itself. So you never have banner inside banner. You never have complementary inside complementary. You never have main inside main. I think that's just confusing. And so these are the patterns that I encourage people to use. Okay. So use of headings. So this is one thing. So headings and landmarks, which one's more important? I know a lot of people in the accessibility field are still focusing on the use of headers as the primary way to indicate sections on a page. So how do these things work together? So these are how I use headings in combination with landmarks. And I've already talked about some of these things. Main landmarks should contain at least one H1 element at the beginning of the section to provide that redundant navigation. If there's more than one main, you can use that H1 content to label the main landmark. The next pattern bullet here is for navigation and complementary landmarks to use the H2 element as kind of indicating the top of those pages. If you have more than one navigation or complementary landmark, then you can use the H2 as the label for that content. And for content info, again, this identifies footer information on a page and should use an H2 too. And the last banner, so a lot of times banner landmark can contain an H1 element. And so how I use H1s on a page is that the H1 in the banner indicates website information, and the H1 in the main landmark indicates the page information, the page that I'm on. So that each H1 has its own purpose. The H1 in the banner tells you which website you're in, and the H1 in the main landmark tells you which subpage in the website you're on. So those are the patterns that I use. Okay. So questions about landmarks? These next two slides, slide 18 and 19, are just other places you can go to look at landmarks. Slide 19 shows a list of landmarks for our local campus information and technologies, which have used landmarks in their design. Another example is the IBM homepage for more of a commercial look at how to use landmarks. And you can look at landmarks, and slide 21 shows the landmark list of landmarks using NVDA. So question, how does AT community feel about multiple H1s on a page? Yep, these are all good questions. I think, when I talk to the people in the accessibility community, there's a lot of different ideas about how landmarks should or shouldn't be used. Some people seem to think, landmark headings is a nice feature, but the headings themselves are the most important things. And HTML5 does have some, well, we got to get going here. Okay. Too much info. Slide 22. I got to speed up here. So 22. We're down to about 3 minutes a slide, less than. So what about HTML5 section elements? And so slide 22 talks about that. The examples I had earlier basically were using divs. So HTML5 section elements, there's already been a lot of implementation of this, but not on IE. So I can't say that you can stop using landmarks and just use HTML5 section elements at this point. But this shows you some of the new HTML5 section elements. So the first one in this table is address. And the second column of the table talks about allowed ARIA roles. So the address element can only have the role of content info. Region, it's proposed. It's not in the spec now, but it seems like people feel it can be. And role presentation. And I guess I just want to spend a minute on role presentation. When you put role presentation on something, what does that mean? What does role presentation mean? Screen readers will ignore the semantics. So if I put role presentation on an address element, what is the developer saying? What is the developer communicating? This is probably a little, not a very common, but if I put an address element in and I put role presentation, what is the developer saying about their design? Well, what they're saying is that, I use this address element, but the content in here really isn't an address. So ignore this. And you'll see that all of these section elements allow role presentation. And so anytime you see role presentation on any of these section elements, you're saying, this really isn't footer information, or this really isn't header information. This has really got something else in it. Or maybe I used header too many times. So role presentation is basically saying, I made a mistake in how I'm using the semantics of HTML5. I made a mistake, and I'm trying to fix it by putting role presentation on it. And probably in ARIA 1.1, there'll be a presentation that will be deprecated, and the new role will be called none. But presentation will still be, because a lot of people have confusion over this word presentation, what it means. So, but we can see here, like the article section. So you can see that there's certain roles that can be put on these different section elements. So article can be article, main, document, application, region, aside, complementary, note, search, footer, content info, header, banner. So there's pretty restricted, main, so one-to-one mappings. And so eventually, once we have good support, and if you want to use HTML5 section elements, you don't have to use the ARIA roles. So ARIA roles in terms of landmarks can be used when people don't, for whatever reason, aren't using HTML5 section elements or trying to repair older content. So navigation can be navigation or region and section. So, and these are defined in the HTML5 specification itself. So I'm not making these up. These are part of the HTML5 specification. So they're providing design guidance for how section elements should be used within an application. And slide 23 here has some links for people who want to learn more about how the mappings are and an implementation of current support for some of these features maintained by Steve Faulkner at the Paciello Group. So slide 24. So one of the other features related to headings in HTML5 is an outlining algorithm. This is a part of the current HTML5 specification. And what this is trying to do, especially, this is a feature I think being designed especially for people who want to create ebooks. Ebooks are fairly, the current H1 through H6 are pretty limited for ebooks, and also people developing ebooks don't want to have to maintain all of these levels. So if they indent something, oh, I got to go change all these H3s to H4s now, or H5s back to H4s. They don't want to do that. So there's whoops, previous. Oh, I guess. So one of the things you can do is if you're using section elements and put headers in them, that you'll be able to, it'll automatically calculate the heading level for that section. So if I put in all H1s and I have nested headings, the browser will actually recompute that heading levels based upon the nesting level and communicate that to assistive technology. I don't think that that's well supported or well understood at this point, but it's a future feature of HTML5 that could help improve the header structure within web pages. So that's, I think, a future feature. I wouldn't rely on that now. Okay, so any questions about headings, sections, HTML5 before we go on? Ooh, wow, 11 o'clock already. We've got a cruise here. Okay. All right. So WCAG 2.0, link requirements, link purpose. So there's two main link success criteria in WCAG 2. One is 244, link purpose in context, and 249, link purpose, link only. So 249 is a AAA requirement. So for most people, that means it's off the table because, we're still working on level A and AA. Level A, 244 is a level A requirement. So how do most people interpret implementing 244, link purpose and context? Anybody? How do people, at least common interpretation of it? Anybody have any ideas? Oh, a lot of people typing. Hope it's related to this question. Looks like there's a lot of other stuff going on here. A lot of people, if you read the techniques for 244, it pretty much it seems to be more of a directive towards, even though they talk about programmatic context, seems to be more directed towards not developers but to users. Oh, if this link doesn't make sense, start reading the paragraph or the previous heading, or some other content on the page may help you understand what this link is. Whereas 249 says the link itself must tell you where it's going to take you, must be unique and identify. So let's just take a look at some examples here. Some of the technique examples is context can come from headings, paragraphs, table cell, or list items. But until there was ARIA, there was really no way for the developer or the designers to indicate what context they were depending on or they want people to use. It was just a guess on the user's part. Where is this content? Is it the paragraph? Is it table cell? Is it a heading? So it really doesn't help users very much. It's current but with ARIA, we can start to change the label calculation and description. So I think there's an important concept in ARIA called accessible name calculation, and as it's applied to links, how an accessible name is calculated is it looks at the child text nodes of the anchor element itself. So typically, the text content, or if there's an image in the link, the alt text of that image. With ARIA now, we could change the name of any element on the page, but including links, by using the ARIA label or ARIA labeled by attribute. So we can actually say, I don't want this link to be this anymore. It can be something else. We also have, in the ARIA algorithm, you can use the title attribute. But in a link, that would only be used if there weren't any of these other techniques. So if there were no text nodes, if there was no ARIA label or ARIA labeled by, but there was a title attribute, that would become the name of the link that's communicated to assistive technology. Another way to define context is to use ARIA describe by. So this is how is this link being described? And this is one way to point to other content on the page. Or the title attribute is often considered a description in accessibility APIs. So if there is text content, a title attribute can also be used to generate description information. So given the time here, what makes a good link? Well, a good link the link text itself should tell you where it's going to take you. And that's usually why somebody follows a link, because the link seems to be someplace where they want it to go. So again, we have the requirements, 244, 249 on slide 30. I got some duplicate slides here. Okay. So if we go to slide 34, let me just put the link in since there was some redundant slides in there. Apologize for that. So here's a page where related to hotels. So a snippet of a page that maybe you did a hotel search and it came back with some hotel names. The hotel names are in headings, and then after each hotel name, there's a horizontal list of links that all have the same link text: more info, maps, photos, directions, guest reviews, book now. There's some source code at the bottom of this page to see what the source code looks like. And if I go to the next slide here, and I bring up a list of links, and again, NVDA, I'll see that they're the same link text. So if I'm just going through the page reading this, I'm just going to hear more info, map, photos, directions, guest reviews, book now. More info, map, photos, directions, guest reviews, book now. There's really no information there that tells me it's related to Royal Palm Hotel or Hotel Three Rivers. So if I'm a screen reader user, now I get to use my screen reading skills to try to find some context for each of these links. So you can see where this could be a problem. Maybe I could go over to headings and I'll find the hotel, and then I'll figure out, okay, the links are after this hotel name. Hopefully, because they didn't do some strange layout thing, it's not for the hotel before or after, depending on if they're using some CSS techniques to change the order of the content. But with ARIA, we can now start to add programmatic context. So slide 36 here shows basically what looks like the same thing, but if we go down to the source code now, I've added a property called ARIA describe by. So maybe I'll have to make this a little bit smaller for people to see. Okay, scroll over. No. Scroll. For each of the links, there's now an ARIA describe by attribute that points to the ID related to the heading with the hotel name. So I'm adding ARIA described by attribute to each link in each section that points to the heading. So now as I tab through this page, when I got to more info, and again, what most screen readers would do is it'd say more info, Royal Palm Hotel, map, Royal Palm Hotel, photos, Royal Palm Hotel, directions, Royal Palm Hotel. When I got to the next hotel, it would say more info, Hotel Three Rivers. So now as the developer, I can use ARIA describe by, and at least when focus is moved to that link, I'll get more information about what that link is about. But if I bring up a list of links using just the ARIA describe by technique, so in this next example, the list of links will still be the same because, as in the previous example, because I haven't changed the accessible name. I've just changed the accessible description. So most screen readers will use the description to provide additional, when it's defined, to provide additional information about a link. If I actually want to change the accessible name, I can use ARIA label by. So this next example on slide 38, if I scroll down here to the source code, I've now added markup called ARIA labeled by. And you'll notice that ARIA labeled by is pointing to two IDs. I point to the ID, both to the ID of the link text, so basically back to itself, and to the ID related to the heading. So I need to do both of these things because when I use ARIA labeled by, it's only going to follow the content of take the text content of the things I point to. So if I just pointed to the hotel name, it would just read Royal Palm Hotel, Royal Palm Hotel, Royal Palm Hotel. So I need to put in the reference back to the current link text. So it'll say more info, Royal Palm Hotel, map, Royal Palm Hotel, photos, Royal Palm Hotel. And the ordering of the IDs is important too. If I put the reference to the hotel name first, it would say Royal Palm Hotel, more info, Royal Palm Hotel map, Royal Palm Hotel photos. So most screen reader users want to hear the difference first. So they would probably want to hear more info, Royal Palm Hotel map, so they don't have to keep hearing Royal Palm Hotel before they get to the different information. Okay? So, and now, if we move on to the next slide here, slide 39, we see that when we bring up a list of links using NVDA, we now see the accessible name has changed. It says more info, Royal Palm Hotel, map, Royal Palm Hotel, photos, Royal Palm Hotel, more information, Hotel Three Rivers. So we've actually changed the accessible name using the ARIA labeling technique. Okay, so there are some comments here. Jeremiah, it's vital here to point out that while a developer can do these things, it's unreasonable for us to expect developers to know and to surmise pertinent linking information. Developers need to know how to do these things, but content and information designers. Right, I agree. You know, I think one of the problems I see a lot, especially, you know, sometimes you have a web development team of one. So one person's both the designer, the developer, the tester, sometimes the content provider, and a lot of most bigger projects, at least on our campus, you know, there's UX designers, there's QA people, there's developers, and these people all have a role, and they all need to know something about accessibility, and probably not the same thing. And so, you know, decisions like this are going to be more of a designer's decision. What's the information on the page? How is it going to be related to each other? And then the specification of how that information, how the developer is supposed to include the context information needs to be given to the developers as part of this design, their coding specifications. And so I think that that's a really important point. And one of the reasons why IIAP is developing these roles. What is the knowledge of different types of people? What's the UX designer's knowledge? What's the web application developers' knowledge base? What's the QA people's knowledge base in terms of understanding these issues? Because a lot of times I feel developers get dumped with the whole accessibility problem. Hey, you know, it's a coding problem. You know, you have to put alt text on the image. You know, you go figure it out because I don't want to. So I think that's an important part of what we need to do. What's the body of knowledge of everybody on the design team? Because I can tell you, if it's not a team effort on accessibility, we're probably not going to get the accessibility we want. And, you know, when push comes to shove, if we're not all for accessibility, accessibility will be pushed out because maybe I'm the only person who cares about it on the team. So, all right, how are we doing? Ooh, okay. Another important part about keyboard is keyboard focus styling. One of the things that I think happens a lot, especially if people are using web frameworks and CSS frameworks, is that they eliminate the outline property in CSS, which is used by most browsers to provide default keyboard focus styling. So it's an important feature to make sure people use CSS techniques, or if they are using CSS libraries, to make sure that they re-establish an outline feature for links and form controls and other things getting focused, so people who are keyboard-only users can see where the focus is. You know, especially if you're doing keyboard testing, sometimes you don't even know where the keyboard focus is on a lot of pages, and a lot of libraries, I think, somebody did a test recently and said, you know, over half the web pages on the web have canceled out the outline property in CSS, which basically means those pages, unless somebody's done something to indicate keyboard focus, you won't see where keyboard focus is. Okay, so home stretch time. How are people doing here? Still hanging in here? Okay. So WCAG requirements related to forms and form controls. So there's a number of 7 different success criteria here, at least single A and double A. Headings and labels, on focus, on input, error identification is big now. You know, it's a great new requirement. Labels and instructions, error suggestion, another great feature of WCAG 2.0. And parsing, making sure you're using standards. Slide 42 here talks a little bit about the different types of ARIA and HTML5 form control issues. So labeling form controls. So the HTML 4.0 techniques are label, the label element, the title attribute, field set legend elements. As the ARIA 1.0 techniques are ARIA labeled by and ARIA label. Instructions, there's techniques related to using tab index 0. So when I'm in application mode or forms mode, you know, some people have tried to put a tab stop on instructions in the HTML4 way, because that was one way to make sure people read it if I'm a screen reader user before I get to a form. ARIA described by attribute is another way. Now we can reference instruction information on a form control. Identifying required and invalid form control. So here, again, we have a mixture of new HTML5 techniques, ARIA techniques, and kind of HTML4 techniques. So with ARIA, we have the new ARIA required and ARIA invalid attributes. On HTML5, there's a required attribute that you can use to indicate a form control is required. And we have an alert role for announcing errors. So, and we'll take a look at a few of these different features. So here's some examples. This is an example of HTML4, kind of the old style technique. So if we take a look at this page, I can put, let me, oh, okay. I can put this example into the to the text chat. So this example shows HTML4 techniques, label for input, for required fields, and the old way to do this is if I maybe didn't fill out a field. So if I go down to the end here, I know we're kind of time. This is basically a pizza order form. If I don't fill anything out, I try to submit the order. One of the main ways to make sure a screen reader would know what the orders are was to put up a dialog box. So this little dialog box has 4 errors. Name cannot be empty, address cannot be empty, phone cannot be empty, enter your phone number. You must select a crust. You gotta at least have one crust. Maybe delivery method should probably also be required here. So this is kind of the old way of doing things. If you show this to a modern developer and say, well, this is what you have to do to make something accessible, they would probably just laugh at you. You know, they'd say, no way we're doing this. This is not the way the modern web works. So example 2 here shows a way that might be, I think, is maybe a better way that indicates information. And so if we submit the form control here, what it's doing here, so some of the new features on this page, example 2, is I've added focus features. So it's a lot easier to tell which form control has using on focus and on blur events on the radio buttons and checkboxes. If I don't fill anything out on this form, I submit the form. It basically now generates a list at the top of the page saying there's 4 errors and identifying the providing links to the form controls that must be filled out. So at the top of the page now, it says 4 errors. Name cannot be empty. Enter your name. Address cannot be empty. Enter your address. So better for accessibility, people know that there's 4 errors. There's links there in the list of errors to get to the form control with the list. And this also improves on focus and blur by providing events and CSS to indicate which element, which form control has focus. And this still uses HTML4 techniques for labeling. Example 3 is more typical, I think, of some more modern web designs. So this is using ARIA labeling techniques, so you can go and look at the source code later if you want to see that. Error feedback through pop-up messages, and using ARIA describe by, and using ARIA required and ARIA invalid to mark required and invalid fields. So if I go through this page and I get to the first element, I don't fill it out, what happens is you see a message pop up next to it. Name cannot be empty. Enter your name. So if we go into an inspection tool, inspect the element, hopefully you can see this. Can I make this bigger? Good. I'm going to make this a little bit bigger. We can take a look at what's on this particular feature now. So maybe make it a little bit bigger. So the code here now has ARIA described by, so some of the things. So we have ARIA required true. Let's see. Okay. Okay, it doesn't have the ARIA invalid, so there's a bug here. I apologize. I missed that. But what it does do is have ARIA required equals true, saying this is a required form control. ARIA described by points to this idea of the span, which has the error information. And this has the role alert. So, and it has the content, name cannot be empty, enter your name. The role alert is an alive region role, and alert means it's a high priority. So when something has a role alert and the content of it changes, that'll be immediately spoken. So if we go back to the page, and I come to this page, and on the name element, as I move focus out of it, it'll say, name cannot be empty, enter name. So there you have information there. So the person can hear that immediately, that, okay, there was a problem. They go back, the ARIA described by will now, when that gets focused, again, ARIA described by is pointing to that, so it'll reread that information. The screen reader will reread that information. You know, name cannot be empty, enter your name. So we're providing much better feedback using these ARIA techniques and much more consistent with ARIA practices. Okay, so so any questions? There's a lot of stuff here. I'm sorry I don't have a lot of time, but there's a few more slides I want to get through. The last slides here, I just want to briefly mention that a lot of these design patterns and things that I've been talking about today have been codified by the Open Ajax Accessibility Task Force. We're developing open source rules that can be used in evaluation rules for meeting WCAG 2.0 requirements using ARIA and HTML5 techniques. So we have weekly teleconferences to talk about the rules. Some of the people here today are in that group. We're using those rules in 2 tools right now that are publicly available. One is called the Functional Accessibility Evaluator. It's, again, an open source tool, so you can use it, or if you want to download it and use it yourself. It's still under beta. We're hoping to have 1.0 out by next month, and people would be able to download it and run it themselves if they want to. We also, slide 48 here shows e-inspector sidebar for Firefox, again using the same evaluation library, but it's a Firefox extension, and that it'll run the rule set and provide you with feedback on a specific page, where FAE 2.0 spiders a website and will provide you with information about the accessibility of the pages on a website. E-inspector is for analyzing the current page and highlighting the information, accessibility related to WCAG 2.0. So I'm not leaving a lot of time here at the end. So I think that's pretty much my presentation. I'm sorry I didn't leave a lot of time for questions at the end, but I'm open to questions. I don't know, Sharon, if you've been keeping track of major questions people have.
I've been watching the questions, and I believe that either you have answered them or they've been answered by other attendees. I'll just say, if anybody had a question that was not answered, if you could go ahead and type that into the chat area, we'll try to catch that and get that answered for you. We only have 5 minutes remaining. However, I also want to let everyone know that we are doing something a little bit differently for today's webinar, and we're actually going to open up a community for just attendees or registrants of this webinar, and we'll open that up within IAAP Connections, and we'll leave that open for probably 1 to 2 weeks, which will give you all an opportunity to continue the discussion on some of the things that John has talked to you about today. And we'll automatically enroll you. So when we send out the post-webinar email, we'll send you a link to the feedback survey, a link to the recording of today's webinar, and then we'll let you know when that community in IAAP Connections is available to you. And again, it will only be available to those of you who are registered for today's webinar. And if you're not currently a member, IAAP Connections is for members only. If you're not currently an IAAP member, you can still join at no cost for membership. Just go to the IAAP website at accessibilityassociation.org and sign up, and then we'll get you linked into that community. So I'm looking, John, do you see any questions that you need to address?
Well, Ted Geese had a question about tooltip, the role tooltip. So on a lot of web browsers, like the title attribute is considered a tooltip, but some people want fancier tooltips, so that might be pop up and provide more information. So the design pattern for that is if it's like for a form control, or you would use ARIA describe by to point to this section of content on the page, and you would give that section of content the role tooltip, so people could be oriented that that's a tooltip information. But it's only when you go to when you move focus to the form control, it would read that tool, whatever in that tooltip information. There's potentially other design patterns that could be used. I know that, again, instructions is an important part of a lot of more complicated forms, and that's something that the ARIA authoring practices group, and again, if we have a few minutes, I'd like, if people do have time or have an interest in working with the W3C on developing the specifications, or especially I think the authoring practices. There are group meetings weekly now. It's Mondays from Central Time. It's, I believe, noon to 1:30. I would please contact me or the W3C about participating. If you're interested in doing some testing, we have a testing group here at Illinois that's starting, or I can point you to other people who are doing testing. But I think one of the big questions people have here is, great, we got all this new technology, but where does it work? Where doesn't it work? And more importantly, where it doesn't work, we need to start reporting bugs. If we want a web standards-based accessibility, we need to, instead of just saying, oh, boy, yeah, they got a bug, I'm not going to use that, they don't know what they're doing. We need to tell them where the problem, or where we think the problem is, to help them understand, to make something better. If the web is getting more complicated, we can't ignore accessibility defects. It's got to be something that people consider part of building the web, is making sure the accessibility stuff works as the way it's specified. And where it doesn't work where it's specified, we need to report those bugs. So that's my web standards soapbox.
John, that's great. We are out of time. But so first I want to say thank you, John, for doing such a great job. A lot of great information. And the audience was terrific too, helping each other out with the questions. So a lot of content was covered. And I also want to thank Jeanette, our captionist, who did a fabulous job keeping up with all the information. So again, thank you, everyone. I want to go ahead. I'm going to put up the link to our feedback survey. So on this slide, when it comes up, there we go, you'll see you can just click on that link. We'll also send the link in the post-webinar email that we send out. But we really do appreciate your feedback on both today's webinar and all other webinars that you've attended. You'll see on this slide I've posted some of the upcoming topics for 2015. I wanted to let you all know that within about the next week, by sometime next week, we should be able to post all of the webinars for 2015. We've got a full schedule that we already have built out for our webinar series, so I hope you'll all join us in 2015 also. So with that, again, I want to thank everybody for joining us today. It's been a great webinar. And just to close out of the webinar today, all you need to do is close your browser and hang up the phone if you're connected via the phone. So again, thank you all for joining us. And like I said, look for that email. We'll let you know when the community within IAAP Connections is available so we can continue some of this discussion. So thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful day, and I hope to see you at a future webinar. Thanks, everybody. And again, thank you, John. Fantastic job.